Hello and welcome to this seminar on ethical versus fraudulent authorship, organized by COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics. This is part of the online COPE Seminar 2021, themed Together Shaping the Future of Publication Ethics. I'm Trevor Lane and I'll be your moderator for this webinar. I'm a publishing consultant joining you today from Hong Kong, and I've been a COPE Council member for more than 5 years now. And in the past 25 years, I've worked in editing, publishing, and training in Asia and the US. For full disclosure, I now occasionally provide author training for Asia Edit and Nature Research Academies. Here's the agenda for this session. After an introduction to the topic, there'll be an institutional perspective from Sam Oakley, and then a journal perspective from D Kharasch, and the last 20 minutes will be devoted to a Q&A session. So again, please type your questions specifically in the Q&A box, and if you wish to ask a question to either Sam or Evan, please include their name at the beginning of your question. All attendees can see each other's questions and can upvote ones they want answered. Our first presenter today is Sam Oakley, Researcher Development and Integrity Specialist at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. Since 2019, Sam has developed and run the university's research integrity training and has been promoting and supporting research integrity more widely within the institution. The second presenter is D Kharasch, who is Editor-in-Chief of the journal Anesthesiology, which is a COPE member journal. He's also the Vice Chair for Innovation and a professor at the Department of Anesthesiology at Duke University in North Carolina in the United States. So first, let's take a closer look at the issue of authorship. Of course, it's only one of many possible ethical issues in research publishing, here referred to as undeserved authorship. It's not viewed to be as serious as the three issues widely treated as research misconduct, namely FFP, or fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. But there are many other items that could be added to this chart, ranging in seriousness. Some fall under the vague umbrella term questionable research practices. Some unethical issues are in citation and peer review, and I've added not registering clinical trials or obtaining ethics board approval, as well as gift, guest, and ghost authorship, which I'll discuss in a moment. To uphold integrity in research publication, COPE has 10 high-level core practices to enable all those involved in research publishing to reach the highest standards in publication ethics. They cover all ethical issues, including allegations of misconduct, authorship and contributorship, complaints and appeals, conflicts of interest or competing interests, data and reproducibility, ethical oversight, intellectual property, journal management, peer review processes, and post-publication discussions and corrections. For the issue of authorship, the recommendation is clear policies that allow for transparency around who contributed to the work and in what capacity should be in place for requirements for authorship and contributorship, as well as processes for managing potential disputes. Of relevance here is also the COPE core practice on data policies, as data sharing is encouraged, but dataset ownership and authorship may be complex and different from manuscript authorship. Relevant COPE resources include flowcharts, guidelines on how to handle author disputes, a discussion document, COPE forum cases and case discussions, and a summary of the COPE seminar on responsible authorship from the 2019 World Conference on Research Integrity. As for manuscript authorship, advice is to transparently state author contributions as free text or via an itemized framework such as the 14 contributor roles taxonomy or credit items. There have been calls for relying only on credit lists, as in the movie industry. Until then, journals need to record contributions while also defining criteria of contributions and roles for authorship and having relevant policies and procedures, including for handling authorship conflicts. It can be argued that incorrect authorship declarations and bylines count as fraudulent behavior because of misrepresentation, forgery, identity theft or impersonation, perhaps grant fraud, and usually plagiarism of another's work. Gift authorship could be treated as institutional misconduct, and adding author names to ghostwritten industry articles could represent an illegal act. Gift authorship may be transactional to reward a minor material or service contribution to the study, or just payment of, for example, the publication fee. Gift authorship could be given to a senior researcher out of respect or coercion, or to a colleague expecting this favor to be returned later. Guest authorship may be given to a famous researcher with or without their knowledge for superstar, name recognition, or faked endorsement. And ghost authorship is denying authorship to a deserving author, such as to remove a real or perceived conflict of interest. The author may be demoted to the acknowledgement section or omitted completely. These three types can occur together in ghost written work. But wait, there's more. An author may be fake or a real person but with a false email as part of a sting or revenge operation, or a corresponding author may publish a study without the consent from co-authors, giving a second meaning to unauthorized, or an author may forge the signatures of the co-authors. Unethical authors may pay a paper mill to create bogus papers or use a paper broker that sells authorship positions on already accepted papers. Knowingly helping predatory publishers by submitting a paper to them is shown here as mutualistic cleaner fish pursuing a shark. This could be fraudulent because the counterfeit paper is not a real academic article and proper peer review is being bypassed to pad out a CV, misrepresent authorship or citation, or spread misinformation. Cases brought to the quarterly COPE forum consistently involve authorship issues, such as questionable authorship changes, alleged ghost authors, ghost guest and gift authors, and unauthorized submission. There are usually other problems like duplicate publishing, salami slicing, stolen data, and undeclared conflicts of interest. Several cases highlight institutionalized gift authorship, but it must be noted that cases of author disputes usually need to be resolved by authors or their institutions rather than by journals. In academic publications, the prevalence of inappropriate authorship seems to be quite high. It's not really treated seriously enough, and it's a breach of researcher, institutional, funder, and public trust. Unethical authorship may be a sign of other ethical breaches and a symptom of the wider issue of incentives driving the wrong indicators of performance, success, and value. There are always some self-interested actors or bad apples, but bad behavior tends to spread and get learnt, and whole barrels become rotten. The whole tree or community of practice may be affected, but the problem is probably deep-rooted and systemic. Indeed, the whole orchard or research enterprise may be affected by a network and environment using faulty incentives, just as the Wood Wide Web of good microbes determines the health of plants. Researchers need to be nurtured by a healthy underlying culture and ecosystem. Remedial action is starting, and guidelines promoting research integrity among multiple stakeholders include repair, clue, and COPE guidelines, but these focus on fixing problems. Proactive initiatives to improve research culture include the DORA statement and Hong Kong principles on assessment, Leiden Manifesto on metrics, Singapore statement on research integrity, and Montreal statement on research collaborations. But how can these statements be implemented, and where do we go from here? So at this stage, I'd like to pass the screen and microphone to our presenters, Sam Oakley and Evan Kharasch, starting with Sam, who will give an institutional perspective on ethical authorship and research culture.
So thank you very much, Trevor, for that introduction. That's very kind of you. So I'm here to speak about activities at the University of Glasgow, where we're aiming to help our researchers to navigate the challenges of publication decisions in a way that both supports the highest quality research, but also gives them the best opportunities for their career. And as we know, those two things don't always coincide, and often that's where the problem is. So for us, supporting researchers with this really sits at the heart of our work on research integrity and more widely on improving our research culture. And I'm going to suggest to you that the work that institutions do on research culture is absolutely key for promoting ethical authorship as well. So I just wanted to start quickly by thinking about the relationship between researchers who publish and the institutions that employ them. So obviously, researchers bring the talent, the skills, they do the research, they're essentially free to publish whatever and wherever they wish. And we don't put any formal checking process on that. So obviously they're highly independent professionals. We rely on their professional judgment for that. But just as perhaps we don't have oversight of that process very closely, I think we also perhaps don't see the extreme pressures that many of them are under that can affect the decisions that they make. And I think particularly in this instance of early career researchers who really feel the brunt of a lot of the power imbalances and also the sort of hyper-competitive nature of the research culture in which they operate. So I think it's obvious to say most institutions really care about the quality of their research. They want the published record to be true and accurate. And that's not just altruistic. I think also this relates to the pressure that we are put under in turn by funders and by governments, the governance requirements that are put upon us. So it is partly linked to our reputation. And this is very much my personal feeling, I think a real reason why institutions need to care about this is for our staff well-being, because as probably most of you know, the stress of authorship issues arising, it can be really extreme. And I think it's really sort of very unproductive for our researchers to get caught up in this kind of issue. It can be incredibly damaging for them. And it can also really reinforce inequalities. So for me, that's one of the key drivers for us engaging in this space. But if you're not convinced by that, then of course there is the cost, the sort of the money and the time and the effort of unpicking and investigating issues when they arrive is another real reason why institutions need to be very active in this space. So what can an institution do? I think we can do lots of things. And I will suggest to you as well that I think alignment of activities is key to give them their real force in this space. So obviously we need to make it clear where we stand on these things. So for us at the University of Glasgow, we have a code of good practice in research. And I think that covers a lot of the core practices that Trevor mentioned. But we do put an enormous, actually quite a lot of detail in there on authorship. So for example, we talk about the responsibilities for publication, and in our code, we put that very much onto the PIs. We say they are responsible ultimately for overseeing what's published from their teams. We also have clear authorship guidance. And again, that really echoes the ICMGA guidance with a little bit extra added. We talk about where to publish and suggesting where might be most effective. And we also make sure that our open access mandate and our support for open research is in there as well. So we also have some teeth to that code. So the code is kind of there to guide our researchers in what we think is good practice. But obviously the flip side of that is we do have a misconduct policy and a process as well, which does cover people who fail to follow what's in our code. But this also makes very clear that authorship issues are included in that. So section 2.25, we cover the failure to include legitimate authors on outputs or granting authorship where none is warranted. And we have a clear policy and process for investigating complaints that are made to us. We also touch upon authorship in the PGR code of practice. So for our PhD students, this kind of explains the responsibilities of the student and the supervisor in negotiating publication. Obviously, we've got a plagiarism policy. And as Trevor touched on too, I put our responsible metrics statement right up there as well in terms of supporting ethical authorship, because we make clear in that we're not endorsing misleading quantitative proxies for evaluating research. I think those encourage quantity of publications. They're very damaging. We advocate a mixed approach where we take into account a lot of qualitative evidence too. And I would say that at the university, what we're finding is local teams or projects often are taking the time to develop their own local good practice handbooks and protocols. So these build on our institutional policy, they don't conflict with it. But just to give you an example of this, one team has a lot of technicians that work with them, and it was felt that there was inconsistency as to whether or not technicians got included as authors. So that team, they had a consultation exercise, and they've produced a local statement to guide practice in that area. I think this kind of thing is really, really valuable. It keeps discussions alive about authorship, and it makes it a much more active process at the subject level. I would also like to reinforce what Trevor said about the credit roles. So we have a lot of institutional support for the credit taxonomy. We signed up to it very early. We think this is a really good way for our researchers to show their contributions and also their responsibilities on a publication. It makes it clear who's perhaps should be an author or who maybe is just along for the ride. We signed up early, and we've also added functionality to our repository so that if a journal isn't officially using those roles, we can capture the metadata in our repository as well. So, and this is a really good example, I think, of how we're working with our colleagues in the library, who in particular give really good support for publication decisions and data management. And I think this touches on the fact that at an institution, it's not going to be one area that's leading on this. So we have the library involved, we have a culture and careers group, we also have a whole network of research integrity champions and advisors who work on a local level. Of course, we do face the challenges of internal communications. I think most organisations do. So we have some fairly static resources. We have a lot of advice on our web pages, for example, on research integrity. Again, open access from the library. I've just given you a screenshot there. They touch upon the issues of avoiding so-called predatory journals and thinking about where the good places to publish might be. We've also got a research integrity Twitter account, which we use to basically stalk our academics on Twitter and try and get them to follow us. And then we're pushing out always new good guidance, good blog posts, good articles, anything like that. We're sending out to them there. But really, I think the main way that we are actively pushing out, promoting good authorship practice is through our research integrity training. So we have a fairly extensive program of this at the institution, and this is run centrally, and it goes across all subject areas, and it's mandatory at our university for new research staff and supervisors and those who are on our early career development program, which is a tenure track style of program. So our staff training, it sits on Moodle. It's an interactive course. And the key thing about our course, I think, is that it's reflective. This is the way that we've made it work across all subject areas. So we have to go from, we have medicine, we have creative practitioners, we have pure maths, we have qualitative researchers. As you can imagine, it's quite hard to talk across all of those. But our course is constantly encouraging people to learn about the key issues that we have in the world of research and then relate it to their subject area. Research integrity training is also mandatory for PGRs. And again, they have a slightly different structure. They have an online course, and then they have a 1-hour webinar that's facilitated by our researchers. But I think we really include quite a bit of content in this, particularly on authorship, because we know that this is something that most of our researchers have struggled with at one point or another. And I've just given you a quote on here, and this isn't a policy quote, this is my words in a video in the course, but it will give you an idea of the sort of the passion that we're putting into this to try and get them to engage with the issues around authorship. So we say that everybody, all our researchers, need a developed understanding of how authorship is decided, that it matters to get it right, and that senior staff or supervisors actively care about getting it right. And it does seem to be working. We get really good responses to our training. It's very popular with our researchers, and we often hear stories then of what has happened to people in the past. And we give them tools such as credit and other suggestions of how that you can approach discussing about authorship in order to have more productive conversations in that area going forwards. So again, and we have a lot of content in that course as well on those questionable research practices and on plagiarism too. So although it's not compulsory for every single researcher, we do reach a very large number of our staff with this. And this is the main way that we're encouraging them to get to grips with that code of good practice and to start local conversations. I think that's really the key aim of our training, is that we want people to start those local conversations about authorship. So I think that's some of the stuff that we're doing in terms of policy, education, resources, but really our research integrity training sits within a much bigger piece of work on research culture. And I'm going to end the final part of my presentation by talking a bit about that, because I think that all this activity, the policies, the training, it won't count for anything if the institution's overall direction of travel is in a completely different direction. Now, I don't think it's controversial to say that I think most of the problems around bad publishing choices are driven by an unhealthy research culture, which values quantity over quality, where there's abuse of power, theft of ideas. This is all part of a very hyper-competitive environment. So we see this work as mission critical, not just to drive up the quality of our research, but to improve our culture. The two go absolutely hand in hand. So we see that a better research culture is not an alternative to excellence. So we're not compromising on that, but it's what will enable more of us to excel. And we've had a really big program of work on research culture at the university. The first part of this was to define what we actually mean by that, because it's easy to talk about good research culture, but what do we actually mean? So we define this as being one in which colleagues are recognised and valued for their varied contributions to research. So that's very important. We want to include everyone in this who's contributing to our research, who support each other's careers and are supported to produce work that meets the highest standards of academic rigour. So as I say, we're not compromising on rigour. That's right in there in our definition on research culture. So what are we actually aiming for? What we're trying to do is to just shift the way of thinking about what we value in research outcomes. And I'll explain to you how I think this links to authorship. So outputs, of course, are really, really important, but we're also really bringing up there in terms of importance, both societal impact. We're seeing a lot of our funders putting a much greater emphasis on that, and also on the people who are involved in the process. And it was Tanita Cassidy who has done a huge amount of work for Glasgow in this area. And she highlighted this tweet, which is from the chief executive of our UK RI funding agency. And this tweet says that that person's become very committed to the notion of one's net contribution to the research system. There's the research you've done, and there's the research you've enabled others to do. So it's getting that shift. So it's not just about one person's outputs that they're churning out. It's about how they're helping the big picture of the research culture. And I think if you just stop for a moment and think about some of the unethical publishing practices that go on, a lot of them are really quite neutralized if you start thinking in that frame of mind, because why would you be trying to squeeze your name onto more publications or, you know, salami slicing your research? It doesn't fit so well if you start thinking about the big culture in that way. Now, I will say the work that we've done at Glasgow, it's been going on for some time. This is our latest research strategy where, again, we're highlighting collaboration, creativity, careers, helping each other to succeed. And also, these are our key principles. Again, we value the quality of our research over its quantity. The university succeeds when our individual researchers succeed, and how research is done is as important as what is done. So again, this is at the heart of our new strategy that will govern the next 5 years. By working in teams, building on each other's ideas, and making Glasgow the best place to develop a career, our research transforms lives and changes the world. Now, you can see that's exactly the sort of big ambition that every institution will have, I'm sure, in its strategies. But this really aligns, I think, with our policies and all the work that we're doing to try and increase awareness of how important authorship is and transparency about publication. So I think this, obviously, it doesn't wave a magic wand, but it does signal what the institution values and the direction of travel that we've got. So you can see we've been working on this for some time. Back in 2015, long before I joined, we were focused on research integrity. We have done a lot of work on collegiality, bringing that into our promotion criteria, a lot of work going on to help ECRs with their career development. We've signed up to DORA, we've got our responsible metrics statement, and our plan for the future is to do a lot more work on open research. So just to highlight again one of those things, we've updated our academic promotion criteria, and this has basically been widened. So we're not just looking at outputs rigidly, we're looking at equal credit for outputs and impact, rewarding those who show collegiality and commitment to open research practices. And I can give you a link to our work on research culture, and you can read more about these if you're interested. We monitor progress with the Research Culture Survey. We ran that in 2019 and we'll run again this year. This is useful. This is our way of benchmarking. And just to show you, you get a sense here of some of the things that we're asking about. One of these is, I understand what good authorship practice is. And we can break this down by different departments. So blue is everyone's quite happy. Red shows there might be a problem. And we can again look across those themes. All those questions, if you're interested, you can find on our website, and I'll share the link. And just the final point I'll make, because I know I'm over just 1 minute over time, is that we formalized all this activity into a lab for academic culture. So this is kind of an institutional entity that's going to take this agenda forwards and run projects in the sector, and also work with funders, because it's no good us just doing this alone. We want to work with other institutions. We want to work with funders to try and get the sector as a whole all working together. I think that's so important, because there's not much we can do on our own. So that was everything that I was going to say. I do realize that was quite a whistle-stop tour, and I'm happy to share links and answer questions on any of that. But I should say, it's definitely not me who's done all the work on that. Tanita Kashi, Miles Paget, also Elizabeth Adams, absolutely key in driving forward our work on research culture, and very much take the credit for it. So thank you, Trevor. At that point, I'll stop, and I'll stop sharing as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Sam. Before we go on, can you just remind us what PGR stands for? Is that postgraduate researcher?
Yes, I'm sorry. I
Okay,
shouldn't be
thanks.
using acronyms without explaining them. Yes, PhD students, if you like.
Okay. So now I'd like to call on Evan.
Thank you, Trevor, very much. I very much appreciate the opportunity to participate. I also very much appreciate the work that COPE is doing. I'm an avid consumer and participant, and the work of COPE has been very instructive and valuable to me in my role as an editor-in-chief. My intersection with responsible publishing and authorship predates my time as an editor-in-chief. In a prior institution, I was the university's vice chancellor for research, and all of research ethics ultimately reported up to me. And in my first day on the job, I received an email that said, the university needs a new authorship policy. And nothing like starting with a monumental challenge. And I learned the importance of the cultural aspects of authorship. And that means very different things to people in astrophysics than it does to biomedical science or medicine and the humanities. And the challenge is how to get this right for everybody. I have no disclosures. And it's remarkable how much our three perspectives are aligned. To kind of ground us, I chose the COPE member survey from a couple of years ago that identified the prevalence of the authorship problem. 49% of the participants said there's a problem in terms of lack of education among authors and reviewers. 45% said there's a lack of training and education among authors and reviewers, and 42% said that assessing contributions and claims of authorship or just authorship issues were very prevalent. I was motivated in my role as the editor-in-chief of our journal to recently publish a very long editorial about authorship, and we asked the question, what counts, who counts, and who cares? And we tried to address all of those because we too saw and continue to see authorship problems in the submissions that we get at the journal. So we take a perspective and to ground this, addressing the issue of why authorship matters. And these are statements of a number of different cognizant organizations. Authorship confers credit, obviously, but it also implies responsibility and accountability. And so much of the emphasis is placed by authors, by institutions, on the credit side of things, and responsibility and accountability really get short shrift. And it's often only when there are issues of questionable publications and research misconduct that anybody really pays attention to responsibility and accountability. But credit and accountability are really inseparable. We think that there needs to be minimum requirements for authorship, and that's really two things: substantial contribution to the work and the accountability for the work done and the publication that results. And that it's critically important for all authors to understand and adhere to criteria for authorship. And those criteria are discipline specific. They varied between disciplines. Criteria for authorship in an institution in which people work. Only about 24% of institutions, degree granting institutions, have criteria for authorship. And my experience is the vast majority of faculty don't even know that they exist. And lastly, it's important that authors know the criteria for authorship to the journal to which they are submitting. And in an era in which a high percentage of publications are not accepted and they're simply sent somewhere else, most authors don't necessarily understand that the criteria for authorship may differ from journal to journal. We know that there has been authorship inflation. I'll highlight for you a couple of publications. One was an analysis of the first 50 articles published each decade in the Journal of the American Medical Association, the New England Journal of Medicine, and the British Medical Journal. I'm a biomedical scientist, I'm a physician scientist, so I tend to have a little bit of a focus on biomedical publishing. But what they found was a steady linear increase in the number of authors per article, decade over decade, regardless of the type of study that it was. When they did an analysis, they concluded that increasing research complexity is not the explanation for the increase in author numbers, but rather the growth in authorship is inflationary. A similar study addressed the question and asked, is it complexity of the science or is it competition that's responsible for this authorship inflation? And by complexity, they meant the technical sophistication of research processes, the number of individuals, the team concept of research, if you will. From the competition side, they said, is it due to pressures from evaluative criteria, such as grants, patents, publications, citations, the influence of promotion and tenure, and the concept of social capital, as well as pressure, again, from scarce resource allocation or grants. And they found that, again, authorship increased about one author per article per decade, that journals with higher impact factors tended to publish higher authorship articles. If you're sending to high impact journals, if you will, more people want to get on that bus. They concluded that authorship inflation was driven primarily by research competition, not by complexity. And that the major problem is that you have increasing numbers of authors. This really incentivizes weaker criteria for authorship. At my journal, we recently did an analysis of 134,000 articles that have been published since 1965. And again, we found that same metric of about 0.5 to 1 author per year, per decade, per article, year over year, over the course of the past 5.5 decades. So authorship inflation is one thing, but fraudulent authorship is different. Authorship inflation is problematic. It is disconcerting because of the devaluation concept But the bigger issue is the inclusion of gift and guest authors, because this is unethical and it is rampant. And the contention is that such authorship practices really are a type of misconduct. And let me share with you 3 case studies. The first may be the best known one. It's the case study of Snuppy, the first cloned dog. And one of the authors on the manuscript which reported the cloning of Snuppy was Gerald Shetton. He was listed as an author on that article because he recommended that the research team use a professional photographer to get a good photograph. Another case study, a case report of that described ventilator sharing. Ventilators are used to mechanically ventilate patients. It described the sharing of one ventilator between 2 patients. There were 2 sets of 2 patients, and the shared ventilation was done for 1 hour. So a total of 4 patients, 1 hour worth of observation, and there were 20 authors on the manuscript that was submitted. And then another case study where an editor wrote to the journal, wrote to the authors and said, you know, the number of authors on the manuscript really appears to be excessive. And the corresponding author wrote back and said, look, I've got a bunch of clinical fellows who collected samples at night and on the weekends, and I can't pay them extra, but I need to compensate them somehow, so I made them all authors. 3 examples of inappropriate authorship. So if we formalize this, and we've heard this before, gift, guest, and ghost authorship. Gift authorship is honorary or courtesy authorship when somebody has a sense of obligation or tribute or respect or dependence on an individual who's not contributed to the work, and it's done in exchange for anticipated benefit. This is the most prevalent form of unacceptable authorship, and there's cultural aspects of this as well. There are some cultures in which it's customary to put a department chair on a manuscript as an author, and that is not considered to be ethical in contemporary times. Another form is guest authorship or celebrity or prestige authorship. You put famous professor Dr. So-and-so on a manuscript hoping that it will increase the likelihood of publication or credibility or the status of the article. And then ghost authorship is the failure to identify somebody who was an author. And this can range from a major contributor who's not named all the way to for-hire or commercial authors. This has been looked at recently, and between 1/4 and 1/3 of published original research articles have 1 or more honorary authors. And honorary authorship is positively associated with journal impact factor. That is, the higher the impact factor of the journal, the greater the likelihood of there being 1 or more honorary authors. Everybody wants to be famous. Well, why does it matter? This is one of my favorite quotes. Authorship abuse is not a victimless crime, because the entire industry of research and publication relies on trust and the public trust. And if scientists or clinicians are willing and prepared to lie about the people who are involved in a research project or a paper, why should we expect them to be any more honest about their findings? The authorship byline is not less important than the content and the message of the manuscript. So the question is, why do these problems exist? Well, this is actually authorship misconduct has now become a scientific discipline unto itself. And there's been some very good articles that have been published about this. And the prevailing theory is the credit economy of science. And what we have is credit-motivated fraud, or if you want to put it more philosophically, thumos, honor and esteem, have begun to replace nuos, or the finding or thirst for truth. And there's a complex interplay here between authors, institutions, and journals, which are every bit responsible for what is going on. Scientists have become more motivated by credit, regard, and status. People in academia are feeling increasingly pressured from institutional grant requirements, as well as from the appointment and promotions process. It's been said that appointments and promotions committees are better at counting than they are at reading. Institutions are part of this as well, because they're seeking credit, reputation, status, financial gains from grants and donations. And there's this interesting dynamic that I call the tension and the dance. And the tension is that authorship is used inside the scientific or academic community to communicate research findings and determine credit and career advancement, but it's also used outside of those individuals. And it's used by institutions for reasons that it was not designed for. And that is metrics of faculty productivity and for institutional ranking. And that's the tension. But there's also the dance, because faculty and institutions are pari passu. They're together in this mutual reward system, which incentivizes this same misbehavior. And lastly, journals too share some of the blame, because they also have become enmeshed in this thirst for thumos, or credit, or status, the search for the impact factor, if you will. And they too have become complicit in the credit economy. So what can be done? What actions can be taken by authors, journals, and institutions to promote ethical authorship and detect or prevent unethical authorship and other fraudulent practices? And let me share with you some journal perspectives, and in particular, my perspective and that of our journal. First of all, I think we need to change the mores. First of all, we need to shift authorship from the transactional to the intellectual. The second is that we need to bring authorship fraud out of the gray and into the light. We all know the definitions of research misconduct, fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism, but there are a number of other questionable research practices which hide in a gray zone, if you will. And I've put authorship at the top of the list. I think we need to move it out of that gray zone and bring it more into the domain of research misconduct and face it and address it head on. The International Committee on Medical Journal Editors says it's the collective responsibility of authors, not the journal, to determine that all people named as authors meet all of their 4 criteria for authorship. And it's not the role of journal editors to determine who does or does not qualify for authorship or to get involved in those authorship disputes. And we agree with that. But nonetheless, I believe that journal editors and peer reviewers can and should legitimately question obvious or potential fraudulent authorship as part of the peer review process, not apart from the peer review process. So what are some of the challenges? Well, there is no universal definition of authorship. The criteria differ across disciplines, between disciplines, across and between fields, institutions, labs, journals. Different countries have different norms and standards. Credit, responsibility, and accountability, after you get past that, which should be universal, authorship is nonetheless cultural, and it needs to be culturally respected and determined. Nonetheless, I think it's important that authors know and understand and adhere to the criteria for authorship within their various disciplines and at the institution for which they work and the journal to which they are submitting, which leads me to my 4th point, and that is journals can and should explicitly define the criteria for both acceptable and unacceptable authorship. Let me share with you an example. Commonly subscribed to are the authorship criteria defined by the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. And they list 4 criteria. At our journal, we have slightly different criteria and have redefined this and published this recently. We have 5 criteria, not 4. We specifically call out ethics and integrity, and we specifically label all of our criteria. But a very important difference in the domain of scholarship is that we require participation in the execution of research. The ICMJE requires participation in the acquisition of data. And we believe that the execution of research is an intellectual exercise, whereas the acquisition of data is simply transactional. And we say that all authors must meet all 5 criteria. And anybody who meets those criteria must be an author. If you meet fewer than 5 of the criteria, you can be listed as a collaborator, or you can be listed in the acknowledgements. And we spell out what these are. We list something called non-author contributors. And these are people who don't meet all 5 criteria. And we provide a number of examples of activities that do not qualify for authorship as a way of explicating and illuminating this for contributors. Acquisition of funding, general supervision, administration, mentoring, physicians who, quote, provide patients, scientists who, quote, who provide reagents or animals or other materials, simply collecting samples, technical editing and proofreading. These are all non-author activities. And we specifically call out ghost authorship and define that the participation of a professional writer in a manuscript must be disclosed for transparency. If that professional writer meets all 5 criteria, they must be an author. If they only drafted or participated in some of the research, they should be identified in the acknowledgement section. And then lastly, I think journals can and should create these non-author mechanisms for appropriately recognizing scholarly contributions. Again, we've created the concept and the category of a non-author collaborator. And again, these are people who work in a research group but don't meet all 5 criteria. The nice thing is that PubMed does have a mechanism for listing collaborators, and they are listed separately from authorship. So again, this holds authorship to a higher standard, but also enables giving credit, if you will. And this is, for example, what a listing on PubMed looks like. There is an author byline, and then there is a list of collaborators as well. So to summarize, this is going to take the concerted participation of authors, institutions, as we very nicely heard from Sam about, as well as journals. And I think journals have to actively define and publish their criteria for acceptable and unacceptable authorship, provide non-author mechanisms for recognizing types of contributions. We need to attend to this in peer review, and I think we need to take fraudulent authorship head on as a form of misconduct. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Evan. And now we come to the question and answer session. And now some questions have come in, and the first one is to Sam, but then I'd like to ask Evan as well. So hang on, I'll stop sharing and go back to gallery. So Sam, given the impressive engagement with credit at Glasgow, do you see any evidence of the same issues that traditionally affect authorship of an article affecting use of credit? For example, are some contributor roles seen as more prestigious or valued? And do you think the parallel shifts in research culture will mitigate this?
Yes, I wouldn't particularly say that I can give an answer as to whether some roles are seen as more prestigious or valued. And again, I think that would be very much subject specific. I certainly think that the credit roles are as open, potentially as open to abuse as just authorship. But what I do think is it gives a granularity and a transparency that I think makes it a lot harder to sort of have unethical people put on that list. So I think in terms of local discussions about authorship and local awareness of who's being added to papers and for what reason, I think it does help for that. I don't think it's a magic wand, certainly, but I think it does help. I think it's definitely a big step in the right direction.
Thank you for the answer. And Evan, I'd like to ask you a related question. Does your journal Anesthesiology use the credit items, and how does it align them with those 5 modified ICMJE criteria that you use?
We have talked about the credit question at several editorial board meetings, and have consistently come to the conclusion that this is not something which we would find valuable, and we don't use it. And the reason that was given by several editorial board members was that if people will not be honest about their role as authors, why would they be more honest in their role in the credit system, which is simply more granular? So for that reason, that's not something that we have implemented.
Okay, thank you. And related to that, and there is another question related to that too, even if journals, so there are some journals that do use credit, and then as Sam says, universities can use credit, but that's why I asked you whether it aligns. I see a kind of disconnect that it seems to be an independent thing from authorship. People can list what they did, but then, as your presentation said, Evan, what counts as authorship? So which combinations, weightings of those credit items or other systems, which ones count as authorship can vary by discipline, journal, institution, anything. And then we do have a question saying, you did mention culture as well. So how does that play into things? Is there leeway? Is there a different system used if you know someone is from a certain culture that uses a different system?
Yeah, a good question. And when I talk about authorship being cultural, let me show you two lenses on that. The first is if we look at disciplines of astrophysics and particle physics, it's common to see publications with hundreds or thousands of authors, because the culture in those disciplines is that there may be 10 or 20 years of technical work that goes into creating devices or technologies which are ultimately used in an observation. And it's considered that those individuals who created all of that machinery and technology and devices do merit authorship. And that's the culture in those disciplines. The culture in humanities and the process in the humanities looks very, very different. That was one of the challenges that I had as a vice chancellor for research, to try and craft a university-wide authorship policy which respected those different cultures, if you will. There's also national cultures. There are some countries in Europe where for a long time, it was customary to put the chair of a department on a manuscript. Those kinds of cultures do need to change and are changing. Some are changing more quickly than others. But that's what I mean by cultures, if you will. And frankly, I think that journals have an opportunity to help that change.
Thank you for that clarification and interesting answer. I'll come back to you in a minute, and there's a question for Sam now. How often do academics need to take those training courses that you spoke about? How often are those courses updated to include current research trends and new threats?
Thank you. Yeah, so at the moment, the only sort of official guideline is that staff are required to retake it every 5 years, which isn't really that frequently. But I would say that how it's actually playing out at our university is that there's some departments that have kind of mandated that everybody should do it, and then everybody's doing it all at the same time. And I don't know how frequently they will repeat that exercise. How often do we update the courses? Well, it was brand new last year, the one we've got. So I updated it this summer. So I'm planning to update it yearly. Like, for example, there's even in the last year, there's such a growth in emphasis on reproducibility, for example.
Well, that brings me to another question, is what are the performance indicators for something as abstract as enabling or culture?
I will point you to our website for that, Trevor. I've shared a link. I think I answered another question about our promotion criteria, because it's quite a big document. So there's quite a lot of detail in there. And I should say as well, we only brought that in a year or two ago. So we will have a process of evaluating how well that's working and whether we've done a good enough job of explaining how you demonstrate that as well. So that's very much a work in progress, I should say.
Okay, thank you. And a question for Evan, based on the extending the last question, if there's a multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary journal, how would that deal with different cultures coming in, different authors, different co-authors, if it's a mix? And then another question, related question, you mentioned collaborators. Could that be misunderstood as authorship and give false credit to someone who isn't an author?
Good question. I think that our perspective on the collaborators was designed to bring a lot of transparency and to the authorship, not cloud that question, if you will. And we're very specific that authorship means that individuals need to satisfy all 5 criteria. Anything less than satisfying all 5 criteria puts them in the category of a collaborator. But we specifically say that we understand and we value the nature of contributions to research and scholarship, but that authorship, in a sense, is on a higher plane, if you will. It is an intellectual discipline. It's not a transactional discipline. And I think that's one of the differentiators. And the fact that again, I exist today in a biomedical environment where so many of the journals are listed on PubMed. PubMed has very thoughtfully created that mechanism for separately recognizing authorship and collaborators. And I think that is a very underutilized and frankly underappreciated capability. I know that most of the people in my journal were really not aware of it. And so we've embraced that very avidly to bring that transparency to our authors and to our readers.
Thank you. Yes, I think COPE can help also to publicize that more. And then the advice on interdisciplinary journals, or they should also take the collaborator pathway too?
I think that the concept of collaborator versus author is discipline agnostic. It goes to these fundamental aspects of both credit and responsibility. It goes to the fundamental concept that authorship is intellectual, not transactional. And I think that is transdisciplinary, if you will, and can be implemented. Obviously, one customizes, if you will, for your journal or your domain, how you are going to do this. But I think that these are fundamental enough that they can be applied broadly.
Mm-hmm. And the final question for both of you, who should declare contributions, each author or just the PI?
That is something that is, the answer is, in a sense, it's the team, if you will. And we know that to some extent the boss is the boss, but we also know that to some extent that results in inequalities. And when I talk about this internally, and I teach this to trainees and colleagues, that the best approach to authorship is to discuss this at the beginning of an exercise, whether it's research or writing, not at the very end.
Right.
I so often will receive a draft of a manuscript in an activity in which I have been engaged, where the face page is completely blank, and it starts with the abstract.
Right.
Because authorship is left to the very end, almost as an afterthought. And that's kind of like building a building and deciding to construct the foundation after you've constructed the building.
Right.
It's really
Yes.
the other way around. Authorship is foundational.
Sam, is that similar advice you give?
Absolutely, yes. And I think I would agree that the idea about the team being responsible, and I think we really put, especially in our training, the message is you must talk about it, and not even just at the beginning, but throughout the process, and also anticipate some of the real problems. I don't know if everyone would agree with this, but the problems we see as an institution. What happens when somebody leaves, you know, and then the work continues? That can be a problem. Do supervisors always go on their PhD students' papers? I don't think that's a given, but they should talk, you know, it's negotiating. What happens if you fall out, you know, that kind of scenario where the problems arise. So we really want to encourage local discussions about authorship that are ongoing, I think. So yeah, absolutely agree.
Yes, and that's what struck me about your advice too, that you're there to start conversations. So thank you both to Sam and Evan, and to everyone who asked questions. We will answer the other ones that we didn't get to. We've now reached the end of this seminar, so thank you everyone for joining. And this seminar series is called Together, Shaping the Future of Publication Ethics. So we do need all stakeholders to raise awareness of the issues and to respond. And COPE looks forward to welcoming research institution members next year to continue the response and action. And please email me if you have any advice, comments, or suggestions for COPE's future educational resources. So before we go, special thanks go to the presenters, Evan Kharasch and Sam Oakley, and also the COPE staff. And on behalf of COPE, I'd like to thank you all again for attending this webinar, and I hope you found it useful. Thank you and goodbye.